on board the space station. It's now time for our newspaper review. Sally and I will take a look at the stories making headlines around the world. Sally.
Right, well, let's start with Beijing. It is walking a tightrope, according to the press today, in its tacit consent to anti-Japanese demonstrations. So says South China Morning Post, warning nationalist protests could turn against the government.
The Financial Times says the Federal Reserve's bid to boost the U.S. economy with a new round of quantitative easing is being blunted by banks struggling to process mortgage applications fast enough.
And another story in today's FT, it looks at investors who are cutting holdings in South Africa's natural resources sector following the dispute we were talking about earlier, the death, of course, of 44 people in clashes at Lonmin's Marikana mine.
More than 20 years after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty that created the euro, Le Figaro says the French are falling out of love with Europe.
Britain could become the first country to legalise the creation of babies with 3 biological parents, according to today's Daily Telegraph. To prevent genetic illnesses, eggs could be engineered to carry some DNA from a third person.
And the Times shows Lady Gaga doing London Fashion Week disguised as a bouquet of flowers. The creation was designed by Philip Tracy, whose event she was attending.
As you do.
Oh, well.
As you do.
Perhaps. To discuss these, we're joined by Rolake Akinkugbe, who's the head of energy research at EcoBank. Good to have you on the program. Starting with the South China Morning Post and this story that we also have as one of our top stories on BBC World News. Violence in some of the cities in China, spread across several cities, as a matter of fact. But it's interesting that the growth of nationalism in China as a result of this, and equally in Japan, is a major issue. And I suppose what some people might also see through the clouds is the fact that there's a lot of oil under there, isn't there?
Yes, certainly. I mean, one of the key issues is this disputed islands, the Diaoyu Islands, known as the Senkaku Islands in Japan. And its particular stakes are a lot higher because there could be hydrocarbons in the region. Not only that, there are a few other countries in that part of the Pacific who may also be laying claim to this disputed region. But what's more interesting is that the Chinese authorities may potentially be biting off more than they can chew with these protests. There's a lot of nationalist sentiment which they're leveraging on for various political agendas. So, you know, it's quite a worrying trend, and it remains to be seen how far this will go.
And in the meantime, companies like Panasonic, Toyota, Canon having to either halt production or close shops. And it's interesting, I mean, the relationship between China and Japan in terms of just basic trade is so important to both economies. It's extremely
important. I mean, they are the 2 superpowers in that particular part of the world. And even small Japanese business people in China are having to tacitly at least support or be seen to be supporting these demonstrations. And I think this risks escalating actually beyond just the purely commercial dynamics of trade between Japan and China into a much more bigger blown diplomatic dispute, which other members of the globe may wade into.
Well, just quickly still on the subject, the U.S. Defense Secretary is expected to arrive in China as well. He's been warning or expressing his concerns that this could become a hot conflict. Is it a concern that you share, or the stakes are too high for both sides?
I think the stakes are extremely high for both sides, and of course the US now wading into the dispute could add a different dimension to it, which is China sort of putting out its sovereignty as a sovereign nation and wanting to ward off any sort of interference.
Right, let's have a look at what's going on in the States in particular. Of course, Ben Bernanke delivered what many were hoping for, that announcement of more quantitative easing, QE3. But this article in today's Financial Times says that actually the impact may be lessened by the fact that there just isn't enough people in banks to process mortgages. What do you make of this idea?
It's the oddest story, actually, because here we are at another round of quantitative easing known as QE3, and something that's actually quite positive for Obama on the election campaign trail. But the problem is there's a staff shortage within the banks. And so when we see for the very first time that the mortgage rates could be coming down, you can't actually transfer that to customers because of what is essentially an administrative logistical problem in the banking sector. The other side of it is actually the shares in some of these banks, American banks, have actually increased. But the problem with mortgage-backed securities, which is essentially pulling mortgages and then selling them off, is that there is quite a long lead time to see that transfer. And actually this admin problem, staff shortages, is actually just adding much more of a burden to the sector at the moment.
Do you think, though, that this move by Ben Bernanke is as effective as, say, the market's reaction conveyed at the end of last week, and we're seeing a little bit of in Asia today. I mean, the markets really rallied off the back of this move that he made and the Federal Reserve made. They so wanted it, didn't they? They so want the US economy to get going. Is it going to really work, though?
I think they're sending all the right signals to the markets. What they're saying is that we are on top of this and we're trying to do something about it, which perhaps contrasts to what we've seen in the past with sort of frantic decision-making and uncertainty as to which way the whole sector will bounce. So I think it's probably going to be another couple of weeks before we start to see this feed through into the real parts of the economy.
Okay, let's stay with the Financial Times on the business side of things as well. The story that investors are offloading South African mining stocks after these fatal clashes. This is the price that's being paid as a result of the tragedy in Marikana and the ongoing instability. It starts with Marikana and several other mines now. And I think a fair argument could be made that it's also a consequence of the ANC's inability to resolve this issue. I
mean, this is turning increasingly into a political nightmare for Jacob Zuma's government. Investors sort of unwinding their positions in mining stocks is not a very positive thing in terms of perceptions of investment risk in the South African economy. And of course, we know mining stocks and some of the big players are falling. But more importantly is the fact that this strike now is entering its 5th week. There's no resolution on the horizon. There's obviously a disparity in the views within the various unions. And there isn't enough political capital there for Jacob Zuma to exploit to push through a resolution. So this is quite a worrying trend. It's going to have an impact on global supplies of platinum, of course, and potentially even gold, which is another commodity that South Africa produces.
I mean, Lonmin has increased its offer to workers. It's going to talk again to workers today, and they've got this national conference starting today as well. It sounds like your expectations aren't high. It'll get sorted out anytime soon.
I think this is essentially, this Marikana mine problem is actually a symptom of more underlying structural problems in South Africa, socioeconomic issues, sort of the disparity between expectations and what the government is able to deliver. So I think over and beyond what we see as a short-term crisis in the mining sector, this could have wider repercussions going forward, and especially politically for the government.
Okay, there's a front page of the Le Figaro, and tell you the truth, my French isn't terrific, but what it breaks down to is that the French are not very happy with the euro and the European Union.
No,
I mean,
they're falling out of love. They're falling out of love with the EU.
It's a story, I suppose, that could run through the rest of it.
L'amour is dying in France. I mean, it's a love-hate relationship. The polls that were taken actually show that 64% of the French would vote against the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty. 76% believe the EU is not acting effectively, but still 65% of the French think that they should not leave the euro. So where exactly do they lie in terms of their view? But the interesting thing is that France and Germany, which are the biggest economic players in the eurozone, have in the past clashed over policy concerning the bailout. And so German taxpayers will be thinking, actually, we are footing most of the bill. You are romanticizing whether you should leave or not leave the European Union. So it's quite an interesting story.
And with this sort of close after an election in France, it wasn't that long ago that François Hollande came into power. Do you think these kind of surveys really have any weight at all? I mean, obviously it says, you know, this many French don't like the EU, this many do, this many are out of love with it, but so what? I mean, is there that kind of element to it?
Surveys only reflect quite a small part of the population. They're not necessarily reflective of what everybody really thinks about the issue. But it's sort of an undercurrent on the sidelines of what is a more serious crisis management.
Does it feed into, say, what François Hollande might do in terms of policy, do you think? This
not
kind
at
of
all.
survey?
I mean, I think the issues are much more
term.
complex than just a survey on opinions.
Let's touch on the Daily Telegraph. This story about IVF babies with 3 parents, a technique that's been developed by some doctors that's under consideration that would create children who are, if you like, genetically perfect or without any kind of genetic, problems. It does raise some moral and, I suppose, legal questions.
Some serious ethical issues. I do understand Britain wanting to be at the forefront of biological innovation, but, the regulators' report on this particular issue is still to come out towards the end of the year. And it does raise some longer-term concerns if you have 3 potential biological parents, whether a child who's born through that process would want to know and learn their true identity. So I think a lot more thought needs to be going into this.
I'm sure it will be. I mean, it's the trend, though, isn't it, that medicine's going in terms of your genetic makeup and trying to prevent what could possibly happen to you, like serious diseases such as cancer,
and of course,
in the future.
Yeah, there's a good case for that, but it needs to be tried and tested, and it needs to go through the normal, I guess, due diligence and ethical considerations.
Right, we'll see how that plays out. Rolake Akinkugbe, Head of Energy Research at EcoBank. It's good to have you on the program. Thank you very much for being with us. That's all we have time for. Sally, shall we say goodbye for now?
Yeah, say goodbye. Thanks for being with us here on the BBC. Stay with us. If you're watching on BBC One, you'll be able to join our breakfast team. But Komla and I will be back with you if you're watching us on BBC World News. See you soon.